Coming up on Network Africa today, rival factions of Sudan's military agree to extend ceasefire by 72 hours as fighting continues in the capital. Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces deny targeting Turkish evacuation plane. Plus, first batch of Nigerians fleeing fighting in Sudan arrive Abuja today on 13 buses. Once again, welcome to the program. Rival factions of Sudan's military have agreed to renew a 3-day ceasefire shortly before it was due to expire. This extension for another 72 hours follows intensive diplomatic efforts by neighboring countries as well as the US, the UK and the United Nations. But there are continuing reports of heavy fighting in the capital, Khartoum. The previous truce allowed thousands of people to attempt to flee to safety, while dozens of countries have tried to evacuate their own citizens. 2 weeks of fighting between the army and the RSF have left hundreds of people dead. The ceasefire was initially expected to end at midnight local time, which is about 11 GMT on Thursday. But early on Thursday evening, the Sudanese regular army agreed to an extension, and its rival, that's the RSF, followed suit hours later. South Sudan has offered to host peace talks, and the army has agreed to send representatives to the talks. Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces have denied allegations that they targeted a Turkish evacuation plane as it was landing at Wadi Saida airport just outside Khartoum today. The Sudanese army had earlier claimed that the RSF attacked the plane, injuring a crew member and damaging the fuel supply. But Turkish Defense Ministry confirmed in a tweet that light weapons were fired on the plane. It also said there were no injuries, but necessary controls were carried out on the aircraft. The RSF accused the army of continuing to bomb its bases in defiance of the ceasefire, which the two factions agreed to extend for 3 days. Now, the Sudanese Foreign Ministry has filed a complaint with the World Health Organization, the WHO, regarding what it calls the occupation of hospitals by the paramilitary rapid support forces, that's the RSF. The ministry said the RSF had occupied 12 hospitals in the capital, Khartoum, which is a gross violation of the international humanitarian law, the rules of engagement and international human rights law that protect the sanctity of these facilities. Several hospitals have reportedly been destroyed by the bombing, and the army is now accusing the RSF fighters of using residential areas and healthcare facilities as hiding places and using civilians as human shields. The RSF has not responded to this allegation. On top of the number of deaths and injuries caused by this conflict, the World Health Organization expects many more deaths in Sudan due to the outbreak, lack of access to food, and lack of access to water, even disruptions to health services, including immunization. Briefing journalists in Geneva, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, said the bloodshed in Sudan is heartbreaking in a country where people have already suffered so much in recent years.
The bloodshed we have seen over the past 10 days in Sudan is heartbreaking in a country whose people have already suffered so much in recent years. WHO welcomes the ceasefire agreed between the parties. We urge all parties to fully respect it. Already, the violence has taken a terrible toll on health. On top of the number of deaths and injuries caused by the conflict itself, WHO expects there will be many more deaths due to outbreaks, lack of access to food and water, and disruptions to essential health services, including immunization. WHO estimates that 1/4 of the lives lost so far could have been saved with access to basic hemorrhage control. but paramedics, nurses, and doctors are unable to access injured civilians, and civilians are unable to access services. In the capital, Khartoum, 61% of health facilities are closed, and only 16% are operating as normal. WHO has stocks of essential medicines, blood bags, supplies for surgery and trauma care waiting for delivery, but we need safe access to do that.
And as fighting in Sudan completes a second week, citizens fear that diminishing food supplies could lead into famine. Khartoum resident Tarek Ahmed managed to purchase bread, eggs and watermelon, among other things, when he went grocery shopping on Thursday, but he fears a food crisis might start. Several shops were seen closed and open bakeries soon ran out of bread. The conflict has also limited food distribution in the vast nation, and which is Africa's third largest, where a third of the 46 million people were already reliant on humanitarian aid. With hundreds of people dead, including humanitarian workers, and thousands of people wounded, the acting resident and humanitarian coordinator in Sudan laments, in his words, looting going on in all the country, adding that it is extremely difficult to assess the additional needs of what is going on in the country. Abdu Deng, who's briefing journalists in New York from Sudan, talked about this crisis.
Hundreds of people have been killed, including humanitarian workers. 1,000 people have been wounded. Looting is going on in all the country, in Khartoum, Darfur. Yet it's extremely difficult as it is to assess the additional needs of what's going on in the country. Even before this crisis, what we call the HRP, the Humanitarian Response Plan, was targeting to assist more than 15 million people, meaning 1 out of 3 Sudanese. That number includes 3.7 million internally displaced people and more than 1 million refugees. The needs are all over the place, whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's healthcare, whether it's nutrition, whether it's protection of civilians.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is warning the Security Council that the power struggle in Sudan is not only putting that country's future at risk, it is also lighting a fuse that could detonate across borders. He adds that this detonation could cause immense suffering for many years and even set development back by decades.
These 10 days of violence and chaos are heartbreaking. A prolonged, full-scale war is unbearable to contemplate. The power struggle in Sudan is not only putting that country's future at risk, it's lighting a fuse that could detonate across borders, causing immense suffering for years and setting development back for decades. Excellencies, the fighting must stop immediately. We need an all-out effort for peace. I call on the parties to the conflict, on Generals Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohamed Hamdan Daglo, Emeti, and the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to silence the guns. It is incumbent on Sudanese leaders to put the interests of their people front and center. This conflict will not and must not be resolved on the battlefield with the bodies of Sudan's people. The Sudanese people have made their wishes very clear. They want peace and the restoration of civilian rule through the transition to democracy. The parties to the conflict must respect the 72-hour ceasefire brokered by the United States and come together to establish a permanent cessation of hostilities.
Hundreds of people evacuated from Sudan arrived Jeddah, Saudi Arabia today across the Red Sea from Sudan. Several ships docked at King Faisal Naval Base, which one ship carrying 326 Indian nationals and another having about 195 people of 18 nationalities on board. Many foreigners remain stuck in Sudan despite the evacuation of thousands by numerous countries. Saudi Arabia welcomed 2 evacuation ships in Jeddah carrying 252 people in from various countries, raising it to more than 3,000, the total evacuated to the country, and most of them are not Saudi nationals. And still on evacuations, the White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre is asking Americans to leave within 24 hours as the situation in Sudan could worsen at any moment. The army late on Wednesday said its leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, gave initial approval to a plan to extend the truce for another 72 hours and send an army envoy to the South Sudan capital, Juba, for talks. The RSF agreed to the extension hours after the regular army.
So following intense negotiation, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and Rapid Support Forces, RSF, agreed to implement, as you all know, a 72-hour nationwide ceasefire starting at midnight on April 24th, which is about 2 days ago. While there was an initial reduction in reports of violence, we are deeply concerned by the increase in ceasefire violations yesterday. We urge the SAF and the RSF to fully uphold and extend the ceasefire. We're working continuously to create options for American citizens to leave Sudan promptly because the situation could deteriorate at any moment, and we are communicating with citizens who have requested information about those options. We have deployed U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to support air and land evacuation routes, which Americans are using, and we are moving naval assets within the region to be pre-positioned to provide any necessary support along the coast. U.S. Africa Command has established a deconfliction cell to facilitate coordination with our allies and partners in this effort, and any option entails a degree of risk. But because the situation is unlikely to improve, we encourage Americans who want to leave to take advantage of the options that are available to them in the next 24 to 48 hours.
The United Kingdom says Gilles Lever, its ambassador to Sudan, has been relocated to neighboring Ethiopia after it temporarily closed its embassy in the conflict-riven East African country. So far, 6 flights have evacuated 536 British nationals from Sudan, but there has been criticism of the slowness of the UK's government's evacuation when you compare it to other Western countries. The existing truce, which was to expire at midnight on Thursday, has not stopped the fighting between the two sides, but it has created some lull for tens of thousands of Sudanese to flee to safer areas and for foreign nationals to be evacuated from there. The federal government has announced that the first set of Nigerians from Sudan are expected to arrive today. The chairman and the CEO of Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Mrs. Abike Dabiri-Arewa, made this known while briefing State House correspondents at the 70th session of the weekly ministerial briefing. She says that 13 buses departed from 2 universities in Khartoum, carrying Nigerian students to the Aswan border in Egypt, where they were to be airlifted to Nigeria. She allayed fears of being attacked by warlords, saying that Minister of Foreign Affairs Mr. Jeffrey Onyama already secured the understanding of the 2 warlords before the transportation of Nigerians by road. Welcome back. You're still watching Network Africa on Channels Television. Deski Bedim knew her family would have to flee their home in Sudan when armed men knocked on her door. She reached a refugee camp in Chad on Wednesday, one of the thousands seeking safety across the border as fighting engulfs their homeland. According to the UN Refugee Agency, the majority of Sudanese escaping their country have fled to Chad. Around 20,000 refugees have so far made the journey, and continued fighting is expected to trigger even more displacement.
On Wednesday, large crowds of women and children milled around Kafrun camp near Sudanese border, where others rested in makeshift shelters of sticks and rushes tagged with pieces of cloth for privacy. Sudan erupted into warfare on April 15, derailing a transition of civilian rule. Since then, clashes between the army and paramilitaries have turned residential areas into battlefields. UNHCR expects a further 100,000 refugees to flee to Chad from Sudan in a worst-case scenario, according to its Chad representative, Laura Lu Castro, who was at the border last week. A wave of arrivals places an additional burden on Chad's meager resources, which were already strained by hosting 400,000 refugees who fled earlier conflicts in Sudan. Suraya Arun and a toddler arrived in the camp early on Wednesday after fleeing Tibelti, the Sudanese village 35 kilometers away. As evening approached, she was still looking for somewhere to rest overnight. Now she faces a new challenge, finding potable water to drink.
And here's VOA correspondent Mariama Diallo from Africa Desk in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for joining us, Mariama. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me, and good to see you too.
All right. The fighting never stopped. I mean, it has not stopped. Was there any agreement as to what areas are safe and maybe for civilians and foreigners are looking to run for safety, or giving them at least time to be able to run?
Well, that's a very good question. And from what we've been reporting since the war started, it doesn't look like these ceasefires have been holding. Yes, some of them maybe for a few hours here and there. We've seen other countries being able to come in and evacuate their citizens. But there is still sporadic, even during those times, there were sporadic gunfires and basically reports of clashes. For this last one, the latest one, that was supposedly that's supposed to be an extension of the last 72 hours. I think it didn't even last that long. I think the acting foreign minister today from one of the IGAD countries from South Sudan, held a presser and was happy to report and to say that, yes, this extension, the newest extension, the newest ceasefire extension was being lauded, but they're also insisting that it needs to be respected. And are there any areas that were safe? I don't know if that was part of the agreement. And I'm going to actually just read to you this woman that I interviewed. It was, I think, maybe 2 or 3 days after that last 72-hour ceasefire. And what she had told me, she is actually a writer and a researcher, and our username, Reem Abbas. And I just wrote it down so I can say it, because it's been, we've been reporting a lot about people running away and people going away, but the people on the ground and what they're dealing with. She basically told me that there seems to be a new reality in Khartoum, and I'm quoting her, missing people, she told me, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters who went to work and who basically or who went to get supplies for the house and who never came back. He said no one knows what happened to them. The streets are littered with bodies. When she was telling me, obviously we can't independently verify that, she said there's a stench. In many places, there are dozens of bodies, again, she told me, lying on the streets. She said people are scared to leave their houses. There are power cuts. There are water cuts. And she said some places have not seen water in a few days. And she said because the RSF had occupied several water plants, especially in Khartoum North. Again, I'm going to say that at least on the side, the part where she says the RSF had occupied some plants, we, VOA, could not independently verify that. But at least you get the picture of what some of the people in Khartoum are going through. In Khartoum and other places in Sudan, by the way.
I can't begin to imagine the horrible experience people are going through at the moment. But apart from the allegations of attacking Turkey's evacuation plane, let's talk about that one. Reports say that the RSF are occupying hospitals. Like you just said, some of them, even though not verified, have occupied water stations. But they're also using civilians as human shields. What are the reports you're hearing regarding this one?
Well, what I'm hearing on that one, and I actually talked to, I think his name is Tom Rhodes. I hope I get his name right. He runs a media house in Khartoum. He's actually gotten back. He's in Nairobi right now, but his staff, he told me about 16 people who are working for him. And he said the only reason they've been able to actually continue to work is that, some of their work is online. And since the army generals need the internet to communicate, so they are able to kind of, when it's on, then take advantage of that and continue to work. And but really in very dangerous situations, very scary moments for his staff. But I asked him specifically about this. He said he cannot confirm, but what he can say is that it's not just also the RSF people doing it, the RSF soldiers who are doing it. If that's happening, it's probably it's on both sides. So it's hard to know which side is committing what at this point.
And now there's a very real danger. Food, people are out of food, water. Do you fear any plans to alleviate a hunger crisis? Maybe an organized food drop from airplanes, or how are aids going to get to? If it gets very bad, how do you think this will turn out?
Well, I think that is also a very good question and another $1 million question. And I think that for the international organizations, the World Food Program and other organizations who are trying to help, that is the problem. I think some of them got criticized recently and said, well, there was 72-hour kind of a ceasefire while people were being evacuated. Maybe you could take advantage and bring in food and make sure that you do something. But I think those organizations, I'm sure they're working around the clock, and if they are not able to bring in food in there is a reason. That's their objective, that's their goal, that's what they're there for. And if they're not able to get food in there, it's a problem. And I'm going to also take another quote again from the same woman that I interviewed about food, just to put it in her words. She said to me, food items or supplies are running low in many supermarkets and grocery stores. For the few that actually have money to buy food, it's becoming expensive and it's becoming very scarce, which is, what everybody, our reporters on the ground and everybody else is telling us. But then he said, for those who depend on working on a daily basis or for daily subsistence to make a living, it's been dangerous to go out. Many women are still trying to go out, work as petty traders, street tea and food sellers. It's amazing to think, with everything that's going on, that somebody, people have to go out. If I have my children at home who are crying and don't have anything to eat, then, they're risking their lives to do that. So she said they make a living even, they're doing it even when they're shelling, they're shooting, and there's gunfire. I mean, it's truly harrowing.
Yeah. In any conflict or war, it is expected that there will be medics, at least maybe on the outskirts of a theater of war, on the borders, and that people will be treated there. What is the situation in Khartoum and the surrounding cities where maybe people are escaping to?
I actually was trying to dig for some answers for that, which I don't have at the moment. But I think the information for the people, at least who are trying to get out of Sudan, who are trying to go to neighboring countries, I'm assuming, I'm not actually assuming. This is like, for example, people who are getting to Chad. I'm sure, they are being maybe put into refugee camps, and then there's maybe some help, but I actually personally don't have a lot of information about that, and I don't want to give you the wrong report, but promise will update you as soon as I get some information about that.
All right, thank you very much, VOA correspondent Mariama Diallo from the Africa Desk in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for your time on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
To other stories now, Finland has returned 2 fragments of sacred historical stones that were carried away by its missionaries during the colonial period. The stones were taken from Odonga, the traditional kingdom of the Ovambo people in what today is called northern Namibia. The fragments were handed over by Finnish Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs Jukka Salvora to Namibia's Education, Arts and Culture Minister, and they will be kept at the National Museum of Namibia It will eventually be returned to the Ondonga traditional community much later. Visiting Finnish President Sauli Niinisto says he called Ondonga Power Stone not only valuable to the Ondonga people, but also a part of the community's identity and its heritage. The president says the return of the stone will serve as an example to all those who stole things from Africa. And that's the last edition of Network Africa for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for watching. I'm Anne Nwawado.